all your money. Come over. Look, you can buy a little shillelagh here for 75 quid. Put it in your bag, tax-free, and then bugger off home to wherever the hell you came from, right? Come here, give us your money, and then go home. And at some point, we're going to stop doing that because the new generation are going to go, why do we want to go there? When the hotels are really expensive, we don't want to go over there and buy a shillelagh, right? No, sod it. We're going to go to France. We're going to go to Italy. If we want Irishness to survive, we have to start giving back to the diaspora.
That's Morag Prunty, a.k.a. Kate Kerrigan, novelist and now playwright and performer in her own one-woman show, Am I Irish Yet? And I'm John Lee.
And I'm Martin Nutty. Welcome to another episode of Irish Stew, the podcast for the global Irish nation.
This episode is sponsored by Shantella, your all-in-one business launchpad in the United States. Committed to excellence and execution, Shantella helps enterprises enter or expand in the U.S. market through bespoke project management and strategic planning solutions. Create and realize your vision with Shantella, where they invest their passion in your future success. To learn more, go to shantella.space. Yes, .space. It's a thing.
Hi, everybody. This is Martin Nutty, and you're listening to the Irish Stew podcast, and I'm joined in the studio by John Lee. So, John, tell us what we got coming up.
Well, today we have the story of a woman I met maybe a dozen years ago in New York, and we're going to learn about her great career arc and her quest in journalism and literature. You know, most of us would like to be considered a successful person. Our next guest is at least two successful people. As Morag Prunty, she was an in-demand magazine editor in the high-energy London publishing world and the author of a series of high-octane comic novels. As Kate Kerrigan, she is the author of approximately 10 novels. We'll figure out if that number is correct. I believe, including Recipes for a Perfect Marriage, The Lost Garden, The Dress, and her breakthrough New York Times bestselling Ellis Island trilogy. She's had an English life growing up in an Irish family in London and an Irish life moving to Dublin and on to Ireland's wild Atlantic way. And now you're often going to find her on stage exploring her Irish identity in a one-woman show, earning rave reviews, Am I Irish Yet? Just the kind of topic we like here on our Global Irish Nation conversation. Welcome to Irish Stew, Morag Prunty, a.k.a. Kate Kerrigan.
Oh, thanks, John. It's so nice to be talking to you at last. It really is. After all these years, you know, it's great. Delighted. Thank you for having me on.
Well, let's kind of open up. We're going to find out about various stops along your way and your writing career, and really want to get into the one-woman show, Am I Irish Yet? But let's just kind of go back. You were living in London, growing up in London, but your childhood summers were spent in Mayo. Take us back and share some of the sights and sounds of that idyllic experience of your childhood.
Oh, my God. Well, it was just that. You know, growing up in London, particularly in the 80s, it was kind of a time of, it was a big time of conflict between England and Ireland. And we just from a very, very young age, there was just those journeys over from the UK to the west of Ireland in the car. You know, and back in those days, there was no seatbelts or anything like that. So there were like 4 kids in the back of the car, Volkswagen Beetle we had. We have small cars here in Europe. In America, you have big cars. It's a tiny Volkswagen Beetle, an orange one. My father would be in the front driving. Often we'd have like my auntie Sheila would be sitting next to him in the front because she was like too posh to go in the back with the kids. And then mum would be in the back, and there would be 3 of us all crammed into the back of this car, and then driving from London to Wales, you know, eating sandwiches in the car, and then on this horrendous ferry where everyone would be sick and drunk, and then arriving in Dublin, and then having to drive from Dublin to Mayo, you know. and sometimes stop along the way, and Dad would go in and get a drink in a pub. We didn't know how long he'd be in there, and we'd be all sitting in the car eating crisps and lemonade, and then driving and eventually arriving in Mayo. And it was just, the journey was really the representation itself of going to another world, going to another place. The journey was so long. Of course, it's not like that now. Do you know, it's quicker for me to get to London than it is for me to get to Dublin. But in those days, it was a big expedition. And it was internally a journey from one place to another place as well, from being a little, London English girl into being, the Irish cousin and the Irish granddaughter.
Let's dial this in a way and talk about your complex origins. You're born in Scotland. You have a Scottish name. You have an Irish mother, obviously, from Ballina, which explains the trips to Mayo. Your father's from Longford, but you grew up in London.
I grew up in London, yeah.
Would you reshuffle the deck in some way? Would that have made your life a little easier?
Yeah.
And if so, how?
I think shuffling the deck didn't. I think it made it quite confusing for me. It's kind of, but my parents, they left Ireland. They both tried to qualify to teach in Ireland. They both wanted to be teachers. My mother failed maths, so she didn't get her final matric. And my father, who was brilliant in school and came first in everything, including in Latin and everything, he was terrible at music. He didn't have a note in his head. So he wasn't able to teach in Ireland. He turned up to his teaching exam, and I think he was half pissed from the night before and sang a kind of a Yashi Pale Moon, and got kicked out of the music exam, and to his absolute astonishment did not qualify to teach in Ireland for that reason. And so they both had to go to the UK to get teaching work. My mother trained in Scotland. My father did his master's up there, and they got pregnant with me. And they were in Scotland studying. And so they just got a job, and they had me and my brother in Scotland in a little new town called Glenrothes, but they had no real sense of the place. And my mother had notions. She didn't want us growing up with a Scottish accent, She wanted us to go to London and be cosmopolitan and be, experience the theatre and the ballet and all that sort of stuff. So, she moved the family down to London, and that's where I grew up, but not before she'd given me a ludicrously Scottish name. I mean, she just had notions, and she heard the name Morag, and she thought, oh, that's really unusual. Why don't I give my firstborn child an unusual name? And I've been kind of stuck with it ever since.
You mentioned the fact that your parents were educators, and it's obviously well known that you dropped out of school at 15, apparently didn't fit into, let's say, a conventional British schooling system.
No.
I imagine that didn't play out too well at home.
No, it was awful. It was, I'd say that my school days were, they were just the most traumatic years of my life for all sorts of reasons. My father was, he was a kind of a bully, and he was very upset that I couldn't get on in school. They sensed that I was intelligent. Of course, now in adult life, I've been diagnosed with ADHD, which makes an awful lot of sense. It's kind of made sense of my life in that way. But my school days were an absolute horror story. And there was an expectation that I would, that I would succeed in an area that was academic as a writer or whatever. And then when I dropped out of school, that expectation, was kind of dashed, if you like. And so I've never really quite got over the fact that I've been able to make a living doing something that I love without actually having finished school. I feel incredibly lucky in that way.
I find it interesting. My own father's circumstances sound somewhat similar to yours. He couldn't function in an academic environment, and I kind of wonder whether he himself suffered from some version of ADHD. But as an adult, what prompted you to kind of get that diagnosis, or what was going on there that you said, okay, I'm clearly not operating in the same way maybe as other people are?
My husband. Our son got diagnosed, and we were puzzled really, and we went into this meeting, and it became apparent that he had ADHD. And my husband, up to that, I just been saying, well, he's just like me, he's just, on my my husband was saying, you both drive me mad, and that's how the diagnosis came about. And it was very much over here. It's still a very there's a very conservative attitudes to it, and even in the psychiatric world, very conservative kind of attitudes. But it's been great for me. It's explained an awful lot of things. And the thing about executive function is it doesn't get easier as you get older. So the things that I used to be able to manage or cope with when I was younger, like remembering my keys and not crashing my car and not locking myself out of the house and all those kinds of things, they just got much, much worse as I got older. So that's really, and it was, I thought it just made sense of an awful lot of things. And so, and of course, I mean, I think it's one of those conditions. I think neurodiversity generally, no more than gender diversity, they're things that have been just not really acknowledged until now. And people just, they lived or died by their ability to deal with these things themselves. And some people survived very well, like me, and other people didn't, and kind of diagnosis and acknowledgement of diversity across the board, it just levels the playing field for everybody, So I think that it falls upon those of us who perhaps have lived lives despite having neurodiverse conditions, or despite being able to overcome them, that we do come out and talk about them and support the younger generation in their endeavors to be accepted, to, alter and adjust the education systems around us, to lionize creative activities as being valid, and to bring a kind of more diverse attitudes towards creativity and towards education into the mainstream, instead of us older people sitting back and saying, well, I'm fine, I survived, so, what's the harm in it? There is. It's a difficult condition to live with. I've been lucky and I'm very hardy, but not everyone else is, So, that's why I'm glad to have the knowledge that I've got now and be able to move forward with that.
It's great to put that out there. It increases understanding, and I have a feeling I wish I had done this myself a long time ago. When you speak of executive function and some of my issues I had in school, but for somebody who's talking about these kinds of issues and your record with education, how surprised were you later, within a few years, to find yourself in a jobs requiring a lot of executive function, editing a publication, and also pulling out a kind of creativity of writing and literature that a lot of other people wouldn't have had. Did you surprise yourself? Tell us a little bit about those early years in London.
I didn't surprise myself. I think that I think there's a few things. I think I was very lucky. A lot of people with ADHD have quite forceful personalities, and I would call myself a kind of like a creative whirlwind. So I think that there are people that just exist like that and then just run headfirst at things and throw everything into a creative whirlwind. And then other people then just kind of come in and pick up the executive function bits. So that's what happened to me when I was editing magazines in the UK in the 90s. I had secretaries and I had assistants and I had deputy editors and I had people doing an awful lot of the executive function things. And that was in the days before technology. So you had somebody there who would type things for you. The world is very different now. Yeah. We're all expected to do absolutely everything. We're all expected to be creative and have executive function. That idea that we had, that was prevalent when we were growing up, which is, there are just some people who are artistic and they're a bit eccentric and we just sort of, let them get on with it. And someone else's job is to, pick up the pieces. And answer the emails, and that kind of doesn't happen anymore. So I think there is an awful lot of pressure on everyone to be able to do everything, and creative people particularly. I never really had any sense of myself or what I did beyond, and I think this is neurodiversity at work as well. I think a lot of creative people that I know that are like this, which is we don't really think, oh, I'm going to be a writer or I'm going to be a thing and I'm going to be, we just literally do the creative thing that's in front of us that we feel like. That's it. And because we love doing it, we do it quickly, and then if we don't like doing it, we just don't do it. So there isn't that kind of sense of, well, now I'm going to be a successful writer and what do I need to do? And, so I would sit down and I would just write a book in a few weeks because I really felt like it. And then if I didn't feel like it, it was really, really, really hard. And then there were things that you just would have to overcome. Like I remember I'd start a book really, really well. And then I just would sit down for a few hours every day. Having children was very good because, you had a child and then you had to get a childminder and they had to come in and they had to look after the child. So you had to do work during those few hours. And then there'd always be a point in a novel where I'd be about 3/4 of the way through and I just would be so over it. I'd be like, oh my God, I actually just can't be bothered to finish this book. Like I've written 50 or 60,000 words and now I have to write another 20. Like I'd always reach this impasse where I just wanted to ring my editor and say, can you just put my phone number in the book and say to people, if they're still interested in what happens in the end, they can ring me and I'll tell them. I really wanted that to happen because I found that last bit so difficult. But then I would just get through it, And so, I teach in Galway University. I teach creative writing there, and the students come in and every year I'm teaching them something different. There are no rules, so I'll be saying you have to do 1,000 words a day and you have to sit down. But really, if you can get the first draft of a novel out of your head onto the page, it's kind of a miracle every time. I don't quite know how it happens.
Well, we want to loop back into the creative side, your career side, but we'd love to get a little flavor at this point before we leave London of your experience of being Irish in London at that time. We've had a lot of conversations. We've had some people from Irish in England who have talked about their experience, very different from the Irish American experience.
Very different.
Could you speak a little bit about your experience and how you see it now?
It's really different. I mean, it was, in London, the people that grew up, like myself, that grew up in London during the 70s and the 80s, when there was a lot of IRA activity over on like what they would call the mainland. There was, we would have had more now. It doesn't compare to what was happening in Belfast, but I'd say that the Irish in the UK on the UK mainland would have had more in common with the people of the north of Ireland than we would have had with people in Dublin and the Republic, because there was IRA activity in England. And we would have been, you basically, you went two ways. You either kind of just kept the head down and just didn't say anything, or you were a Republican supporter, and that would have been my family. Just historically, my grandfather was in the IRA, and then my father was very, political and very angry. And so we would have grown up in that environment. And there were four of us in our family, and we all understood that we were Irish, and we understood the politics, and we understood what was happening. But then we all took different attitudes and opinions to it. I was very Republican. I would have gone on dirty protest marches supporting the hunger strikes. I would have been very confrontative of English peers in pubs. I would have gone for fellas who were joining the British Army. I would have attacked them. But my brother had no interest in Ireland, and my sisters were different as well. They had other things going on. So it was kind of like depending on what kind of family you grew up in, it was kind of like there was a lot of contradictory stuff going on, and it was confusing, and there was a lot of anger. Culturally, it was quite an interesting time, because you had the IRA underground work, who were very, very unpopular. And that was really very much like tainting the whole kind of Irishness thing. Like ordinary Irish people who had no affinities were getting caught up. People were being arrested, like the Maguire 7 and the Birmingham 6, who had either no connection or maybe a very vague and distant connection with the Republican movement. They were all being slung in jail. And then you also had, you had a lot of animosity towards Irish people generally. And it didn't really matter whether you were born in Ireland and over there, or whether you just had an Irish background, because that distinction was really, that kind of hierarchy of Irishness is really owned by Irish people, but not really in the UK. But then on top of that, you also had punk, you had the Sex Pistols, you had that whole punk movement that was really rising up through young people, and a lot of anarchy. And along with that anarchy, then you would have had a lot of second generation Irish boys, Cockneys, working class Irish boys who were Cockneys, who would have made, or, who were either joining the British Army, who've been, many of them rejected by their Irish cousins, who kind of were victims of that Irish hierarchy thing, where they would come home and they'd be supporting, they were looking for somewhere to go. These were angry young men who were looking for somewhere to belong. And they were being told by the Irish cousins, yeah, you're just a tan, you're English, you were born in London, you're not really anything to do with us. And a lot of them then, they would turn to punk, or they would, like Shane MacGowan. Shane MacGowan was very in the punk movement. And you had John Lydon, the Irish boys and the English punks, they were all kind of mixing together. And out of that came the Pogues, of course. But you also had that kind of sense of anarchy and that sense of rebellion. And Irish republicanism was kind of caught up in that in all kinds of strange and confusing ways. So it was an interesting time, but it was a very confusing time. One of the interesting things about my show, Am I Irish Yet?, is that a lot of my peers, which would have been young men that grew up, who are now in their 60s, who had that sense of disenchantment or rejection from Ireland, and that kind of disenchantment of their youth and not really belonging anywhere. A lot of them are really responding to my show, which has been strange, like having men coming up to me because, I'm talking about just 17 and I'm a female performer. And yet so many of the men that come and see the show are coming up and saying it really, what you've said really resonated with me. That sense of, growing up, not knowing whether you were English or Irish, not knowing which side of the fence to come down on.
When you talk, and I guess you used a slightly unusual term from my perspective, of an Irish hierarchy of rejection, do you have a theory on why Irish people reject their British cousins? What exactly do you mean by Irish hierarchy?
Yeah, the hierarchy of Irishness. So that would be seeing, like, say, for instance, you had Cillian Murphy being interviewed a few years ago, and by an American interviewer who said, well, you're British. And he said, no, I'm Irish. And then they were like, yeah, but Britain, Ireland. And he was adamant that he was Irish. Now, that was very admirable. It's also weaponized. It's also a weapon that's used against the second generation Irish in the UK. And there are all kinds of reasons for that. First of all, the English accent is offensive. If you have got that Irish heritage and you have the black and tans, there's that kind of blood memory. So even I dislike my English accent. I don't like my English accent. I hate my English accent. I hear myself on the radio on this podcast and I think, who's that little tan bitch talking about being Irish? Because, like, she's not Irish. She doesn't sound very Irish to me. So there's that. So there's a kind of an unconscious bias that exists even in those of us who have an Irish accent. Unconscious bias exists, it's historical. It's in our blood. There is also, I think there's a class thing at play. If you were very poor, if you were from rural Ireland, where the land is savage and any of the good land was commandeered by rich farmers. But if you were from rural Ireland, the chances were you were poor, and you had to go abroad to get work. And if you had a bit of money, or if you had Yanks in America, you went to America. If you had no money, you went to England and you got the boat. So those of us I wasn't, my parents were teachers, but historically that was what happened. The people that went to England were the people that dreamed big went to America. The people that were trying to feed themselves and their families went to the UK. And the people that had plenty got to stay behind in Ireland. So there is still that kind of thing of, oh, you went over to England, yeah, so yeah. And what they're saying is really like, your traitorous parents went to England in the 1960s. But what they really are saying is, we didn't have to do that. We could afford to stay here. There's a kind of there's that going on as well. There really is, particularly around Dublin. In the country, it's different because people in the country are more accustomed to having English cousins coming over on holiday. The hierarchy of Irishness is really complex, and not really studied or spoken about, outside of me in my show.
But these are some topics that we've touched on. As I mentioned, we had a really great communication with a guy named Doug Devaney, who has a podcast called The Plastic Podcast in England, and he explores these types of topics. And we both actually had on the same guest at one point, Janet Bean, the niece of Brendan Bean. And she had a quote that stuck with me. She felt she was too Irish for the English and too English for the Irish. Can you relate? Yeah, totally. But I think it's changed slightly because now it's very cool to be Irish. It's very cool to be Irish in the UK.
Cillian Murphy. It's no longer a bad thing to be Irish. And so we're now in a situation where if you have an English accent in England and you say that you're Irish, people are like, but you're not real Irish. You're not proper Irish. You're not like the sexy Irish. You're not like Cillian Murphy Irish, like cool Irish. You're kind of pretend Irish, you're plastic paddy. And you're just as likely to be described as a plastic paddy in the UK now as you are in Ireland, because being Irish in England is very cool. The identity of those of us who grew up as plastic paddies in the UK, so-called plastic paddies, those of us with English accents in the UK, we've been completely usurped, because I used to be called London Irish, me, Shane, all of that. We were London Irish. Now we're not London Irish. London Irish are fabulous people from Ireland that have moved to London. Do you know? So if Cillian Murphy's living in London, he's London Irish. Like, we've really been kind of like wiped, And for me, it's very much about, I think it's just, the other thing that you've to remember is that we are, like, I am literally fully Irish, apart from where I was born. My grandparents lived in Ireland. My great-grandparents lived in Ireland. My ancestors have lived in Ireland as far back as we know. My parents were both born and brought up in Ireland. I spent but because my accent is English, that it just, so a lot of it comes down to accent and, how we present ourselves, and let those old prejudices kind of take hold.
I often tell people, I left Ireland in 1983, and I often tell people that when I left Ireland, Dublin was literally falling down around my ears. The notion of a Celtic tiger was it wasn't a notion at all. So you arrived right before that happened. So you saw the very tail end of the miserable Dublin that I had grown up in.
Yeah.
And so, from what I understand, your first year in Ireland was far from a joyride, pretty miserable. But talk to me about when you noticed things starting to change and how that had an impact on you.
So I arrived in Dublin in 1990. And it was so different from London. I mean, it was a big town. Everybody knew everybody. It was surprising and exciting for me, because I came into the media as editor of a women's magazine. So while we didn't have very many resources, I had access to everything. I could meet anyone. I could meet politicians. I could meet pop stars. People in the media were powerful. There was a lot more PR activity, because I left London during the tail end of Thatcher. So we were just heading into a recession. And so when I moved over to Ireland, it would have been on the cusp of the recession hitting and then the Celtic Tiger coming up. But we were earning terrible salaries, and it was quite hard to get a job in the media. But, we were being wined and dined, and we were going to restaurants. And again, it was different times. I mean, if you got something into the page of a women's magazine, there were no influencers or anything like that. There was one influencer, and that was kind of me. So people had to take me out for dinner and take me out for lunch and all that kind of thing. And over the next few years, the Celtic Tiger took off. But it was really, for me, it was that activity of discovering Dublin and discovering a kind of Irishness which was completely unfamiliar to me, which was posh Dublin. Dublin really was not like the Ireland that I knew at all. It was very snooty. It was very kind of privileged. It was a kind of a difficult place to negotiate socially and politically. And I was very young. I was out of my depth. I thought I knew a lot more than I did. And when you were functioning in Thatcher's Britain, that would stand you in very good stead, but not in pre-Celtic Tiger Dublin. it kind of turned you into a bit of a laughing stock, really. So I did struggle the first few years in Dublin, but I was equally very determined to make a life in Ireland, pig-headedly, and that's what I did. And I kept my mouth down. I kept my head down. I downplayed my Irish roots. When I was in Dublin, I, focused on fashion, which is its own country. Fashion is very democratic in that way. You don't have posh people or common people or English people or Irish people. You just have fashionable people, not fashionable people. So a lot of my friends worked in the fashion industry. I had a great time. And then when the Celtic Tiger, I suppose I stopped working in magazines and I got my first book deal around 98, 99. And that was when the Celtic Tiger was really taking off. So I really had the advantage of that, moving into the world of popular women's fiction at that time. I did very well out of it.
Morag, let's get you out of Dublin now, because you went from the major international cosmopolitan London to the capital of Ireland, Dublin. Now you drifted way west on the wild Atlantic Way.
Yeah.
That's got to be another amazing transition. Mm-hmm. And let's see where along the way you started putting together your one-woman show.
So Mayo was a transition, and it wasn't. It was really like I had children. My husband and I got married down here. He loved it down here. And so we just came down here and made our family home here. And we've been living here for, 23 years or something. And my one-woman show really came out of lockdown because I just was... I was stuck on this kind of treadmill of writing books, writing fiction. I love doing it, but the book industry has changed. It's like it's pressure now. And one of the things that I had been brewing for a long time was this idea of, am I Irish yet? About, my experience of being Irish and the fact that no one ever really has talked about it in a way that is really putting it out there. And the play just happened. I have a couple of friends who are amazing. My friend Kevin Toulis, he's a war correspondent, second generation Irish. He wrote the seminal book about the IRA, Rebel Hearts, back in the 90s. He has a wonderful book called My Father's Wake. And we would have we would have connected up on we found a lot of similarities. We actually met we met at the Heinrich Boll, at a Heinrich Boll summer school about 10 years ago, where I was talking about being second generation Irish and he's second generation Glasgow Irish. So we both living in Ireland. So we really connected up, and he's worked a lot in theatre, and his wife Dee has an Irish circus company, Circus 250. And they said, you just do it, just write it. I'm like, well, they just said, write a play, like if you don't want to write a book, just write a play. So I wrote this kind of monologue and I worked it up into a script. I'd never written anything like it before. I wrote it up into a script and Kevin gave me some notes. And then I met an old friend of mine one day, but I said, if I booked a theatre, I booked my local theatre in Ballina, because I thought if I book a date to perform this, then it will happen. So I booked this date in October a couple of years ago, I can't remember, and I then finished the play, and then I bumped into an old friend of mine in town one day. I hadn't seen him for years, and we used to work in like theatre together when we were kids, in Ballina, just someone that and he said, what are you doing? What are you doing? And I said, I've written this one-woman show and I'm going to, I've just written this thing and I'm just going to do it in October. I'm just going to stand up and read it. And he looked at me and he went, what's it about? So I read it to him. And he just looked at me and said, you can't stand up and read that. He said, that's a play. And I said, well, I can't. you know what, I can't give it to an actor. And he said, oh, sod it. And he took a couple of weeks off work and he literally put me on the stage and directed me into performing it. It was like, I'd never done anything like this before. I was like, this is madness. Madness. But I did it. I got up and I performed it in my local theatre. And, you know, everyone came and I got this like standing ovation. And I remember standing looking at all these people and going, what is going on? And people were saying, this is the best thing you've ever written. Do you know? And I knew myself, I thought, I've really done something here. Kind of shocked me. I mean, there's no point, when you're neurodiverse, you don't have that disingenuous thing because everything is so unintentional. I never thought I'm going to write this play, and it was just so unintentional. I was there and I thought, oh my God, like, and you can actually, there's a video of me and I'm just sort of shooing people away and walking off the stage. I'm kind of like, this is so weird.
Yeah.
But then I knew this is what I need to be doing. And since then, it's really settled in me, this show that is about my life, but it's about more than that. It's about identity and it's about my particular tribe, but it's also about that search for identity, that feeling of longing, of place, of loving somewhere, you know, there's an extract that I do where.
Could we hear something from the play?
Yeah. Well, why don't I do this extract? So it's a play about the longing that I have for Ireland. Okay, so there's this extract that goes like this. I'm going to perform it now. Are you all right? My husband asks. He's driving us back from Belmullet, and the sun is setting over miles and miles of purple and orange bog. Flat and bleak and empty. A desert. And I'm thinking, this place is not just my home. It is made of me. The ground itself. Those sods of turf piled up by the side of the road, the black earth they come from. They are the bones of my ancestors, the trees that sheltered them, the animals that fed them. That's where they all are. And that's where I want to end up. I am restless with a deep longing, a need for something. I don't know what this feeling is, not joy, not pain. Are you sure you're all right? My husband says. Yeah, I said, I just remembered something. I can't explain this to him. He followed me here for good schools for our sons and a big house on the sea and a quieter way of life, but those things are just banalities compared to the longing I have for this place. It feels like sadness, but it can't be that. There are ghosts rising through me. So that's just an extract. I can't really perform it properly unless I'm on stage, but it kind of just sums up that that deep sense of longing that we have for Ireland, like a blood memory. Like you come over to Ireland, John. Do you know? You come over. Yeah. Why do you come over? You know, and
I'd go next week if I could.
It's kind of that, isn't it? Because, you know, I go to America and I think, oh my God, the landscape here is so huge and so incredible and so amazing. But Ireland kind of belongs to me. Do you know?
I think there's a term that I've kind of come to over the past few years, and I just call it rootedness. You
Yeah.
kind of really need to connect in like a really deep way. But I'm curious, you said you performed the play first in Ballina, and obviously you performed it in London. I would assume that the audience reactions are different because the perspectives are different. So can you talk a little bit about how Irish people in Ballina reacted to your claim of being an Irish person despite your British accent, and then how, the Irish of England reacted to it, probably being more comfortable with your English accent?
The reaction, well, in England, I'm filling theatres really quickly because it is their story. It is the story of being, it's the story of having an English accent and an Irish soul, and so the title of it, "Am I Irish Yet?" is that's bringing people in as well as the word of mouth. But the reaction in Ireland has been incredibly satisfying. Nobody, because what I'm saying is, I think if you put your authentic self in front of people, they will empathize with you. And so the reaction from Irish people has been more incredible in the sense that they've been coming up and saying, "Oh my God, you're absolutely right. I do that. I'm so sorry. I had no idea I was doing it." Irish people are coming up saying, "Thank you for putting that in front of me." Because what they're used to is people complaining about it. Me saying, "Well, I'm Irish really, and I've got Irish parents and Irish grandparents." So and people are very up for that. Like I will go into places and people will say, "Where are you from?" And I'll say, "Well, I'm from Ballina." And then they'll say, "Not with an accent like that, you're not." Or they will address me Osquelga to kind of just humiliate me. That will happen. But when they come and see the play, they leave going, "Oh, okay, actually, that's not okay. Like, we get it." Yeah. We get it. We understand it because I'm putting myself on the line. I'm putting my authentic, vulnerable self on the line. So nobody is going to come back and go, "Oh, that's bullshit." Do you know what I mean? Because I'm taking the hurt and I'm putting a voice to it. And Irish people are really listening and they're really getting it, and that has been wonderful. And also, I remember I did a show in Nina, and I looked out. It was quite a small venue, and I looked out, and there were two little old ladies sitting in the middle, and they both looked like kind of like old nuns in mufti. They were wearing like cardigans and they'd little perms, and they just looked like two little old grannies. And afterwards they came up to me, and one of them had an English accent, and she said, "I've been living in Ireland for 65 years. And she was crying. She said, "I've been living in Ireland for 65 years and you've just told my story." So when I get reactions like that from people, I know I'm telling a story that is not commonly told.
And also, Mark, it sounds like it is the Irish context, it's the Irish-British context, but it does sound like a universal story for a lot of people, a lot of nationalities. Now, we hope and we're sure that you're going to bring this play to New York. How do you think the reaction will be in New York, or does it change at all when you come here?
No, I don't think it will, because I think that the Irish Americans are very interested in Irish identity in all contexts. Like one of the lines from the show is that, I go on about the great things about Ireland. We've got crack, we've got Guinness, we've got all the, we've got Cillian Murphy, we've got all these things. But the best thing about the Irish is we hate the English. That's the best thing about the Irish is we really hate the English, and we hate them better than anyone else. We hate them more effectively. Everyone kind of hates the English, but we really hate them. And if you're English and Irish at the same time, that's kind of a problem. So that's basically what it is. We're English and we're Irish. And where do you put that? And that's what I think is interesting. And I think, but also behind it, it's just about that longing. It's about that longing, wanting to have an Irish accent and not having one. I've been living in Ireland for 35 years. People still think I'm English, and I am. And also, I don't know how to spell blonde. I don't know how to spell it.
At least you can say it.
I don't know how to say Katie Mildew. I can't do it. And that there is something just inherently English in me that precludes me from doing that. And I think that I hope it would go down well in America, but I have a lot of England to do first and a few Irish to convert as well. So, yeah.
Well, we're going to work on getting you over. I think it is a universal story. I think people of all kinds of ethnic groups would relate to it.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's relevant to all ethnic groups as well. I think it has that kind of, yeah.
Just briefly, and we're going to get into the Seamus plug in a second, but we had a guest on, Luke McManus, who had a very, very interesting documentary film called North Circular, about the North Circular Road in Dublin. And he said after a screening, I think it was an Italian, came up to him and said, "Thank you for making a movie about my city," in Italy. Yeah. It was the same kind, the universal themes. Well, speaking of universal themes, we always end with our Seamus plug. Okay. And we'd like to give you an opportunity to point our listeners in your direction, however you'd like to do it.
Okay, well, you can look me up on katekerrigan.ie and join my mailing list, where I will mail you out stuff about, the show and Am I Irish Yet and all of that. Other shameless plugs. My friend Kevin, if you're interested in all things Irish, my friend Kevin Toulis has an incredible book called My Father's Wake, which I think is published in America. If you're interested in kind of Ireland, it's set on Acclaimed. It's just wonderful. I've loads of books, Recipes for Perfect Marriage. Hopefully the memoir of Am I Irish Yet will be out soon. Oh. And that's all I can think of. I can't really think of anything else. I'm not a very good plugger.
Yeah. Well, you got to be now. You got to have all this talent.
This is America.
You got to be PR. You got to be,
Yeah, this is America. Yeah. I'll think of it. I'll wake up in the middle of the night and think, damn.
We can add it later.
I do merch. Look up Am I Irish Yet.ie and I'll start putting some merch up. Absolutely. I need merch. I need more merch.
So we'll be sure to include all the relevant links to katekerrigan.ie in our show notes. And just wanted to say that for me, and I think for many of our listeners, the message that you're communicating is incredibly important, that the Irish of Ireland need to kind of understand that they're second generation, third generations, cousins offshore need to be embraced.
Absolutely. This is a huge gap. It's a huge political gap, because, what I'm encountering from people who are second to third, fourth, fifth generation Irish is that they have no home in Ireland. So what has happened is that, and Ireland's greatest export is Irishness. That's it. That's our greatest export. It's the notion of being Irish. It's Irish being sexy, St. Patrick's Day, Guinness. Irishness itself is our greatest export. And yet the people that are keeping that alive are not in Ireland. They are in America. They are in Britain. They are keeping the GAA alive in Britain, Irish dancing, Irish traditional culture. It is the people living in America and Britain that are keeping Irishness alive. And in Ireland, that is very much taken for granted. And it is also the Irish who live here they are the hierarchy. They are the royal family of Irishness, the people that were privileged enough to stay here. Do you know? But Irishness as a culture, as a way of being, is less in Ireland than it is in Britain and the UK. And I'm going to give you another little short thing here. Particularly in Britain. So when President Higgins went to visit the Queen, they put on a huge show in the Royal Albert Hall in London about Irish culture. And they shipped in all the musicians from Ireland. And I think they brought down one Irish fiddle player from Scotland who was second generation, right? They had no need to do that. That should have been a platform for all of the second, third generation Irish musicians living in the UK. They should have been given that platform, and they were not considered for 2 minutes. So our role is, how the Irish in Ireland have always looked at it is come home to Ireland, stay in a hotel, diaspora, spend all your money, come over. Look, you can buy a little shillelagh here for 75 quid, put it in your bag, tax free, and then bugger off home to wherever the hell you came from, right? Come here, give us your money, and then go home. And at some point, we're going to stop doing that, because the new generation are going to go, why do we want to go there when the hotels are really expensive? We don't want to go over there and buy a shillelagh, right? No, sod it. We're going to go to France. We're going to go to Italy. If we want Irishness to survive, we have to start giving back to the diaspora. We have to find a way of making them come home. They don't have family here anymore. I have friends in Scotland. People, they run an Irish newspaper in Scotland. They run the GAA in Scotland. They're third generation. Their entire lives is given over to building Irish culture. And when they come to Ireland, there's nothing here for them. There's nowhere for them to stay. There's no centre for them to go to. They can go to the Emigration Museum, but they don't have any purchase here. And the Irish government needs to not just give money to people promoting Irishness abroad, but it needs to give some token that says to people, this is your home. You get, a 10% discount. You have a museum for the diaspora. You have an online central presence. Do you know what I mean? Like, we should all be feeding Irish stew, all of the different Irish podcasts, all of the different academics. We should all have one online presence in Ireland, not New York Irish, not London Irish, not Liverpool Irish, Irish. We should have a place in Ireland that acknowledges us as Irish. And then that's what will keep Irish safe. Stop pushing us all away. We're not going to buy it anymore. That's my final piece.
Yeah, and I do think that's powerful, and it certainly resonates with both John and me, the importance of reconnecting in a more effective way. And so I'm not going to add anything more than that. That should be played back over and over again, because I think it is a productive commentary on the state of how the diaspora interacts with the mother country. And it's important to be constantly exploring it and reinforcing it and taking advantage of that incredibly diverse experience of the 70 million Irish people that live worldwide. So on behalf of myself and John and all our listeners, thank you, Kate Kerrigan, for your passion. Thank you, Morag Prunty, for your writing and good humor. It's been a delight.
Thanks so much for having me on, both of you. It's been a real privilege. Thank you.
Well, Morag or Kate, whichever you prefer, whichever she prefers, she didn't even finish high school, and look what she's been doing. Look at all the things she's accomplished. I think for Morag, there are no rules. She makes her own. And she still has one question she's looking to answer in life. Am I Irish yet? I'm looking forward to seeing that play sometime. And Martin, I think we have to talk to our friend Mick Malamphy of the Origin Theater here in New York and see if he can help bring over Am I Irish Yet?
Yeah, I'd like to see it staged in New York. And the one thing that struck me is towards the end of the episode, I got the sense of, let's say, some of the pain that certain people feel that are longtime residents in Ireland. Many of them of Irish background, indeed deeper Irish background than my own. I happen to have basically a 50-50 setup. I'm half English and half Irish. And so the question that we, a lot of times in our conversation, are trying to resolve is, what is Irish? Is it a big church? Is it a small church? Does it include just the Irish of Ireland or also the hyphenated Irish? Obviously, I fall into the camp of the latter, and I think the country is best served by adopting its diaspora more closely. So I'll continue to bang that drum, and as far as I'm concerned, Morag, or Kate, is every bit as Irish as I am. Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.